Today we are talking about why you should use a professional photographer, and because of that, we've got guest Dan Barker on with us from Dan Barker Studios. You might remember him from IMC number 77 where he's talking about video marketing then. But today we'll be asking Dan about his approach to creating visually stunning and impactful images for his business, as well as maybe him taking us through some of the process that he uses when he's taking photographs. Maybe he's going to tell us some common mistakes, which would be quite handy when we're taking our own photographs or when we're looking to hire a photographer. So that's something else I'd want to touch on as well. You know, what is a good brief to give to a photographer? What we should be looking for? I mean, all of these questions will be answered as we go through. So Dan, hello, how are you doing?
Hello. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me back.
No, pleasure. It feels like it's been ages, but I don't think it's been that long. Maybe I've just been very busy. Perhaps just remind us a little bit about what you do and what Dan Barker Studios does. Not too much though, because we've got the full backstory in the previous episode.
Yeah, sure. So these days we do both video and photography. We focus on industrial businesses, so manufacturers, engineers, tech companies. My background's in aerospace in the aerospace industry before I moved across to go full-time with the photography, and then the video kind of came in and I built that up as well, and I now got a full-time guy who looks after the video production side. I still do all the photography and kind of manage the video side of things. So we're sort of, I guess in terms of turnover, we're about 60-70% video, largely because they're much bigger projects. You know, it takes a lot more time to create a video, and yeah, that's it. I mean, I say we focus on that as our niche, the industrial work. We do other stuff as well, but as you'll probably appreciate, you know, I don't put that out in my marketing really, because I want the message to be nice and clear. But as we're sort of under the hood on this podcast, I'm happy to talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, Dan, we've just been talking before we started recording, and Dan's kindly going to sort of take us behind the curtain to have a look at some of how his process works, so you can get a feel for certainly why it's beneficial to get a creative, a true professional involved, but also maybe picking up some tips that people can use themselves. Do we want to just jump straight in and maybe take us through, give us an example of how you work and the process you go through when you're taking photographs?
Yeah, okay. First of all, I think just to touch on your point of, you know, hiring a professional photographer, the way I got into photography was by doing our own photography for my wife's business, you know, 10 years ago. So I definitely appreciate why and when people need to do the photography themselves, and I'm really supportive of that as well. You know, I was running some sessions for the Growth Hub yesterday and advising people on how they could do their own photography, because I get it, and I get that it's not affordable to begin with. So you just got to do your best and go from there. But I think then when you can get to the point of bringing in a photographer, it's a bit like bringing in an accountant, because we don't all enjoy doing accountancy. So you bring in an accountant for that, don't you? Otherwise you're going to sit there for hours trying to do it yourself. And I guess the same is true for photography.
Yeah, and I think if nothing else, you could, because individuals in the business can become pretty good at their own photography. But I think when you bring in a professional, you get a whole new view of how your product could be perceived and photographed, because they're not just working on their own product. You're working with loads of other clients, and you're constantly getting other ideas and other input into the creative process. So I think you get all of that, plus possibly better equipment, a better eye, better judgment, better time spent on it. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's it. It's the same as, you know, someone not really knowing all the marketing tactics or channels they could use when they come to you. When you go to anyone who specializes in something, they know all of the different, you know, techniques and ways that you could do things and ways that you could show your products. That sort of thing. So,
yeah, definitely. It's certainly, we get a lot of people who are starting a new business with web development, and they need to get a website up, and really I would advise them to do it themselves, because you can get it done fairly cheaply. You can get something up there, and it's just not to come and work with us is going to, they're starting at hundreds of pounds to begin with. So it's not,
Yeah,
it's as you say, you just can't afford that when you're starting a business. So, but it's good to know, because I think actually, if you know the skills that the professionals will be using, you can push them harder and you can get more out of them. So it's always good for them to know
it. Yeah. No, it is nice when people have a bit of input into what we're doing, and I do like that when I get a brief that's, they kind of know the look and feel that they want to go.
That's a good point, actually. I didn't think of that, but actually, do you think a better educated and informed client in your niche of photography is going to be a better client for you? They're going to be easier to work with.
Yeah, I think generally yes. It does depend a little bit, I think, and it's probably not necessarily that they're more or less informed, but it's how much control they want to have over it. Because sometimes you get people who, want a very specific look and feel, and you kind of, photography is like a sort of personal thing in a way. You bring your own look to it, and your own take on it, and it can be hard sometimes. I've had the occasion, not very many to be fair, like a couple over the years, where they've had such a specific idea of how they want it that I'm just not quite going to get there, because it's their thing, and actually in that case they need to just do it themselves because it's so specific. But generally that's kind of people who are artists themselves, and they're producing their own work, and it's very personal to them, and they very much want it to look a certain way. So on the whole, though, I think it can work both ways. Sometimes people are like, right, I just want you to come in and tell me what you think is going to work best and do your best work,
and I'll go with it. Yeah,
I'll go with it. And sometimes they might have a bit of an idea. They want like a sort of light and airy feel to the photos, and they want it to look this way. They want a nice shallow depth of field, that sort of thing. So yeah, both of those work really. But the thing is, if you don't have an idea of what you want, that's when we can come in and bring our experience to the game, to the party. Because you might just be like, I don't know how to photograph this product. I just don't know what I can do with it. I had some a few years ago. They make sort of wire basket products, like like freezer baskets and that sort of thing, that are just like, they're white to start with, but they wanted them cut out and to be shown against a white background. So if you're just doing that on your phone or something, it's extremely difficult. So it's a case of, what can we do to do that? And I ended up sort of hanging them on fishing wire in the studio to photograph them, and getting the light such that you could still just about see the outline of the white wires, if you see what I mean. They're like powder coated wire. So things like that can be very difficult to get across. And then on the other side, you've got service-based businesses who say, well, we haven't got anything good to photograph. We've just got an office here full of people on computers, and that's about it. So what could we do? And then you've got to come up with some creative ideas for what they could do. So those are kind of both ends of the spectrum, really. And then the best ones when you get the ones that have got something that's just really photographs really nicely, and you can just go to town on it and make it look absolutely stunning. So
I mean, I'm sure each of the projects you approach, there's always some challenge or creative aspect to think about, and it's not just, oh, I know exactly how to do that. I'm sure there are some where it's you're following a process and it's a known quantity, but to have these different challenges, especially when there's nothing tangible really to photograph. Certainly if they're doing training, or in some cases like us, we don't. Yes, we do produce some work, but mostly it's us. And so it's really difficult to get that across. And so it's like, you've then got to understand, well, what are you actually selling? How am I going to get across that particular product? Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, what I'd like to touch on at the end, just so we don't forget, is maybe how people might go about choosing a photographer, because I do think it is, you were saying it can be quite personal if their style's quite particular. So actually there may be that they need to look for the right photographer, not just any professional photographer, but the right one who's going to suit their style. So maybe we should touch on that at the end. Claire, please remind us if we forget. But perhaps you were showing me before some photos that you had in Lightroom, and sort of taking us through.
I can show you a couple of examples of you know, things that are possible and that sort of thing. So yeah, as I was saying before, I've run a workshop on helping people to master manual mode and learn to shoot for themselves. So just a couple of examples from that, just to talk about some of the basics really, that you would struggle with on your phone. So things like, these are some examples of shutter speed. So freezing the action, you may struggle with that on your phone because it wouldn't be using a high enough shutter speed, and we can adjust the settings in our camera manually to make sure that we can use a high shutter speed. So imagine.
So with shutter speed, it used to be how long the shutter was open, but with a digital camera, it's how I guess how long it is accepting light onto the sensor.
Yeah, basically. I mean, with the DSLR, it's still the same thing. There's still a shutter there, and it opens,
that's true.
closes. So that's I think that's the best way to understand it. Is it's like some curtains. They open and close. They let the light in, and then close to not let the light in anymore. So with a photo like this, for example, that was taken at 1/1600th of a second.
Right.
So pretty fast shutter speed. And you can see, you know, that guy was coming towards me pretty quick, but he's completely frozen. Same as this one. You can imagine how quickly your foot's moving when you're kicking a ball. If you try to do that.
That was taken even faster then.
Yeah, that was 1/2500th of a second. I mean,
and so with that, to capture that, you are you just taking the one photograph? Are you taking a sequence and then picking the one that's right?
Yeah, I would have taken a few on there. So we have continuous burst mode on the camera, and actually, to be fair, you have that on the phone as well. You know, when you press and hold the button. But yeah, I would take a few in that case, and then pick the one where it all just sort of looked right, all the angles made sense, and felt like a satisfying photo. And then equally, you can get some fun effects when you slow the shutter speed right down. So in this case, I had the camera on a tripod, because when you take a photo at a very slow shutter speed, it can be blurry because the camera is shaking. So it's not just the things that are moving in front of the camera, but it's the actual movement of the camera itself. So camera's on a tripod to freeze, to make sure all of this part looks completely sharp, but then has slow shutter speed with the guys walking past with the bags to give a bit of movement in the photo.
Yeah, so I like this because it brings life to it.
Exactly.
You could just take this photo without anyone in it.
Yep.
But it doesn't feel so real to me.
Yeah, exactly. And then another extreme example of this. So this was at 30-second shutter speed.
Is that in Ledbury?
Yeah, that's Ledbury down Church
I know
Lane.
that pub.
Yeah, but you do. So it's a good one, isn't it? So yeah, this was quite a few years ago actually, when they used to bring that to the fair, and the shutter was open for 30 seconds here. So of course the buildings weren't moving, so they stay nice and sharp. But the fairground is moving, and we get a cool effect with the lights.
And is that having the shutter open for longer going to help with light as well? Because it looks going to be like it's going to be quite dark. So do you get more light in so you can sort of open up the photo a bit more?
Yeah, exactly. So you have to balance your aperture with that. So the aperture opens and closes and lets more or less light in. We'll come to that in a sec. What that does.
Sorry for jumping ahead.
But when it's okay. When it's closed right down like this, you can see up there F22. It's not letting much light in, so that means that I can open the shutter for a much longer period of time.
Right.
And that means that I can, the fair ride gets time to go around a few times, and we record all that light going onto the shutter.
So is that something that's quite easy to work out for you? Is it automatic? The cameras take care of that? Or is it your sort of expertise over time that helps you judge and understand which ISOs go with which shutter speeds?
You have to work it out. I mean, you can put the camera onto auto mode, sorry. But on auto mode, it would just do what it thinks is right. And the camera didn't know in this case that I wanted to capture the fairground ride going around like that. So I have to be in manual mode to be able to prioritize what I want it to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, because I guess if it's open for 30 seconds, which it is, you're even though there's probably not a huge amount of light, you're going to get too much light coming into the camera, and it's going to look too bright or overexposed, I guess, in areas. It's that balance.
Exactly.
How do you know? How do you know what that's going to be? Is that just judgment, experience, or you
It's a bit of both.
experimentation?
You have a meter in the camera, so that will tell you what it thinks is right, but it takes the whole frame and averages it. So if I've got a person, for example, on a light background, the camera will look at that and go, oh, it's quite bright, that whole image. So I have to lower the exposure down. And then when it does that, then the person's skin tone looks very dark. So you have to then take control of it and say, actually, you're not quite right there, camera. You don't know what you're talking about. We need to up the exposure so that the person's skin tone looks correct. Even though the background might get a bit bright in that case. So
yeah, I guess it depends what you're trying to capture, isn't it? If the person is the main focus, then they have to look good. It doesn't matter if the background is washed out a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And then yeah, coming on to aperture. So mentioned aperture, it lets more or less light in, but also what it does is it affects your depth of field. So if we go to this photo here, you can see that this part of the photo is sharp and the rest of it is blurred out in the background. So that's an effect you can get by opening up the aperture to which lets more light in, which means that you have to balance it with the correct shutter speed. But it gives you that shallow depth of field effect, which you might want. So in this case, I wanted this part to pop out from the background. You'll see it done in portraits. You know, if you've got a bit of a busy background, you have the person in focus, but the background out of focus, a bit like the phones simulate that now digitally on portrait mode. So you can get that effect. It's not quite the same because it's not real, it's digital. So
yeah, it's faked a lot of the time, isn't it? And there's something about it to me that it's almost too extreme.
yeah, and
Sometimes.
they're getting better. I think they're like now using LiDAR to actually work out and graduate that that effect as it goes back. But yeah, they're trying to get to this point basically. But then there are some cases where you want the whole photo to be sharp. So in this case, I'd close the aperture right down, so f16 here, if that means anything to anyone, which means that the whole photo is sharp all the way through, because I wouldn't want the back of this guitar to be blurred out. It wouldn't look right as a product shot. Same thing here. This was pretty sharp all the way through. And in fact, we'll come back to these ones because that's a good example of something else. But and then here also, you want this to be sharp all the way through. I don't want this to be sharp and this bit to be blurred out. It wouldn't look right for an interiors type photo. Similar thing here. This is kind of a industrial interiors, if you like. But then here you can play with it a bit. So in this shoot, I wanted to show what these machines could do in the background. So these machines were recycling old aggregate and turning it into sand. So I wanted to focus on the sand here with the machine in the background, a little bit blurred out, but your eye goes to the part of the photo that's sharp.
Yeah,
it automatically does.
But it helps give context, doesn't it? Because you could just have a photograph of the sand, but it wouldn't necessarily mean much. But having shot like this, you can see where it's come from, or you might infer where it's come from.
Exactly. And then in this one again, I want this to be sharp all the way through, because I want this to be sharp and I want these to be sharp. So your eye can sort of dart around and look at the whole photo.
Yeah, and it's an interesting. You've chosen an interesting position as well. It looks quite exciting. What's going on? How do you think about composition of photos?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't know that I know the answer to that really. Like I just kind of go, and when it feels right in the looking through the viewfinder. I know that's a really annoying answer, but I'm not quite sure how else to, like, for me, it's like the angles and everything have to just look satisfying, and it kind of on this one. Sorry, I'm using my hand pointing at my screen, but it sort of it kind of fills the frame. So these kind of come up to a satisfying part. I mean, in fact, I can do this for here. Well, in fact, you can see how the original photo was. It wasn't quite as straight. I've cropped.
Yes, you've skewed it round. Yeah.
But if for example, that was like that, for me, that wouldn't be quite as satisfying, because there's no breathing room between the end of the conveyor belts and the edge of the photo. So that's why I went for that crop on that one.
Yeah, so cropping can be quite important then for photos.
Cropping can make a big difference to where you're focusing on the photo. So, and that's a good basic skill that anyone can, technique that anyone can use, because you can do that on your phone. You can go into the basic edit functions on your phone and crop. So that's a good thing for someone to do if they're just taking photos on their phone and putting them on social media or something. Just think about the crop for a minute. Is that is it making people focus on where they want to be focusing on? There's a thing called the rule of thirds, which is a good starting point for this, which you probably heard of.
Are you able to put that over one of your photos?
Yeah, I'll show you one here. So again, this example, very shallow depth of field. Wanted to focus on the kit here rather than the person. We've got a lot of other shots in this shoot where we were focusing on the people, but in this one they wanted it to focus on the kit itself. So nice shallow depth of field. So if I put that crop frame over there, you can see it splits it into thirds for us here. And the rule of thirds says that if you position the part of the photo that you want people to focus on either those third lines, or even better at the intersection of the third lines, then that makes a satisfying composition. So I heard it once described more as a result of thirds, where you make a satisfying composition and it happens that it occurs on the thirds, which is probably a better way of looking at it.
Well, yeah, I think 3 is an interesting number in things that are pleasing. So for me, in copy, a list of 3 is good. 4 is too many, 2 isn't enough. And so a list of 3, it sounds nice when you're saying it. You've also got thirds on a web page. Maybe you split it into thirds. So you have a 2/3 image, then a 1/3 image, or split that other 1/3 image into 2. It just feels better. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. I think you can look to nature and see that thirds come into it. I think there's the golden ratio is an element of thirds,
that's
effectively.
Right. Yeah.
I think it always makes a third. So as you've got is it the golden spiral? Or the golden ratio, but it always makes thirds, or out of everything. So maybe it's just a happy chance that what looks nice to us is actually these thirds.
Yeah.
So would you do that if you were positioning? I don't know if you've got an example of this, but if you were taking a picture of a person and that's the focal point, would you would then want to position their face on one of the intersections of the lines?
Yeah, you probably
Roughly.
would. You probably would. I don't know that I've got an example in what I've got here actually today, but yeah, it's a good starting point. So if you're taking a photo of somebody and it's landscape like this, then yes, you might put the person here. If I just put the overlay back on, you might put the person here.
Yeah.
And that would just give you a slightly more interesting composition than if they were just in the center. But that said, it depends on what the purpose of the photo is. So, putting them to the thirds can give that sort of slightly more, is ethereal the right word? That kind of, I don't know.
Use it. Yeah, let's go with it.
I don't know if I'm using words that mean anything here, but, just gives that sort of slightly more artistic feel, I suppose, and a bit more thoughtful, maybe. Whereas if they're in the center, might be because you want the viewer to look directly at them. You're trying to put across a very specific message, and you want them to be, center of the photo. So it does kind of depend what you want them to be doing. But one thing to bear in mind when you're positioning people at the edge of the photo is that another sort of general rule is that they should be looking in the direction of the space. So if we use this as an example, I know we're not focusing in on him here, but if I put him here like that, that works because he's looking towards the space over here.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Whereas if I
And actually, you could have taken that photo differently, where you'd focused on him looking at the machine and cropped it like that and had it positioned like that, and that would look right.
Yeah. So if he was there,
yeah,
you can see he's looking into the edge of looking to the
and
short.
you wonder what he's looking at.
And you wonder what he's looking at, and your eyes kind of going over here, and it's like straight off the photo.
Interestingly, when I was at university, we studied. We did a lot of videography. As you know, I don't do it now, but when we were doing it, we were going through different styles, especially the positioning. And one of the things they said is, if you want to create anxiety, is to put space behind the person. So get people over to the edge of the frame and have a big space on maybe the right or the left-hand side, because we want to fill the space, and we think, what is going to happen in that space? Is someone going to leap in? Is a car going to crash there? What's going to happen? And I see it so often in films, and they use it to create anxiety, even if nothing happens there. By positioning people off there, it does make you a little bit anxious, a little bit.
Yeah.
You can see it a lot in horror films and things like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? All that stuff.
But you don't want that for business photography. You don't want people feeling
you don't
anxious,
want anxiety, really. You want comfort and everyone feeling good about things. So yeah, so that's just some basic examples of what you can do with some of the basic settings that you might not be able to do in your phone, and why, when you get to the point where you can afford it, that you might want to bring in a professional. But there are plenty of other things that we would bring to the table as well, like, as I said, how to show a product in the best light, how to how you could show something in a use case that maybe someone hasn't thought of, or they haven't figured out that angle or something like that. I mean, a bit like what you said with this. So this was shot on a very wide angle lens. Let me have a look. Should be coming up. There we go. So this was shot at 14mm, which, if that means anyone to anything, is very wide. A bit like this one, which was at 20mm, which is pretty wide.
Yeah, it's how estate agents get those images that make the rooms look large when they're not.
Exactly. But sometimes you can use that for some fun effects. If you go in really close on a wide angle or something, you might just be able to make something look pretty cool. That's otherwise a bit boring, maybe. So.
You were showing us earlier an example of lighting. Now, I think lighting is so important in images and video. You had a good example where you were setting up for a shot. Would you mind showing us that? Because I think it's great to see it's got some good tips in it, basically, on how to take a good photo, but also the lengths you go to take a good photo.
Yeah. So I'll show you two examples then. One that people can probably use straight away, which is this. So this photo was taken at, well, you can have a look, actually. It was 21st of June at 1:30 in the afternoon. So the sun's really high in the sky. Kind of that thing, when you're growing up, you get taught to have you say, make sure the sun's behind you when you take a picture, and blah, blah, blah. But you can see on here that he's got really dark shadows under his eyes.
Yeah.
And at first, when someone looks at this photo, they might go, yeah, okay, that's just a photo. But I span him round and put him in the shade and took the second photo literally about 30 seconds later. And that's the difference. So that's the difference that lighting can make.
Yeah, because that's because he's not getting the harsh sun directly on him. Is it more reflected light?
Yeah, so in this second example, I span him around 180 degrees, and he was in the shade of those conifer trees behind him.
Yeah.
So he's got a nice, soft, even lighting on him. The thing is, the auto mode on the camera might have thought that he needed to be a bit darker than that, but because I'm shooting in manual, again, I can up the exposure and make his skin tone look how it should do. I think the other one that you were mentioning was...
Yeah, it's an interior shoot.
And we got the interiors one. So yeah, so along here you can see you've got 12 shots that I took to get to the final shot. And I'll just let me just go to the before, so this is no editing on it. So first shot, kind of lining it up, trying to make sure the whole composition looks okay. The focus here is the kitchen, so I was photographing for the cabinet maker that makes this that made this whole kitchen. Let me sort of go to a next shot. Wasn't too much change there, and I turned the lights off. So I quite like the way these interiors look without any of the lights on. So you can see there the difference between all the lights on and all the lights off. So we've got some natural light coming in from the left here through patio doors, and a bit of light coming in through that window, of course. It's a bit dark over here, and you can see there's a door open here which has got a light on inside the downstairs loo there,
and it draws you in, doesn't it?
Gives you this sort of orangey effect.
Yeah.
So I had to adjust the camera settings to make sure the exposure was okay for this, because there's less light there because we don't have all the lights on. Then the next one, I shut that door, so we sort of bring the focus back to the center a bit more. The next one, then, recognizing that side of the photo was a little bit dark, what I did is I actually, because this room through here was a boot room and there was no windows in there, so I actually put a flashlight around there to give it a little bit of extra light. But you can see I've not quite positioned it right there. It's super bright on the ceiling and everything. So turned it down a bit, still a little bit bright up there. And then what I did is I actually moved the flashlight into the boot room itself rather than around the corner here.
As if it's a window in there.
Yeah, and then I brought the power up a little bit, and can you see here, there's a little bit of light starting to appear on the floor there. So it just gives that feeling that there's a bit of natural light coming through. And then I just cranked up the power a little bit more and a little bit more until it was sort of feeling how I wanted it.
Yeah, it's nice. It's matching the other side, isn't it, where the patio doors are?
Yeah, exactly. And then that's the unedited shot. And then that's the final edited shot. So I've adjusted the white balance, brought the exposure up to where I want to, added contrast, things like that, because we shoot in a raw file format. So the raw files are very flat. They don't have any contrast or anything built into them, but they retain loads of information. So when you come to post-production in here or in Photoshop, you can do loads with the file. So it retains all this information.
And I see you've straightened up. There's a beam, a sort of covered beam at the top, which was slightly off angle. So you've kind of straightened all that up to make it look how it would look if you were there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because you wouldn't necessarily look at all these bits and say, well, that's out of line. Whereas it's easy to do that in a photograph. So you've made it look how if you were there, how it would look. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And you have got to get it as right as you can in camera.
Yeah.
Because you can't correct everything in post. But so having the camera level and everything does help. I had it straight. I was probably slightly out with that. You can see that, like you pointed out, that beam.
Yeah, it's gonna be difficult though to get all the lines straight. You've got the most important one, which is the
and then you can straighten that up and make it all look nice and
and you've cropped it in, and you're now very much focused. And it's amazing the difference just shutting that door and bringing that fake light in from the fake window in from the right. It's just a touch, but it does make a huge difference. Yeah. And I think it's that subtlety, isn't it, that seems to help. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's all light. I mean, like I showed you with the picture of Sam and the sunlight. Photography means painting with light, and it's all light. So you've got to get the light right. Do
you think that's more important than anything else? Or is there a sort of hierarchy of importance for a good photograph?
Good question, actually. I think it kind of is, but it's up there really with the composition and everything as well, I would say. If your composition's completely off, like we were talking about, and someone's looking off to the side of the photo, maybe that can kind of ruin the whole photo as well. The light thing is interesting because some people just wouldn't realize it. Like the example I showed you of Sam, that first photo, a lot of people would look at that and go, oh yeah, that's fine, looks like it's a sunny day. But it's not until you show them something that's lit properly that it changes everything, and they realize, okay, it is all the light, and that's making such a huge difference. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, it is. The amount of headshots I've seen, I put a lot of headshots on websites where they're stood right against the wall with their back pretty much against the wall, and there's a
Oh, yeah.
shadow coming out one
Oh,
side of their
yeah.
head, which makes their head look slightly deformed and weird. No one seems to think that's a
Yeah.
problem, and it's like,
Yeah.
just come away from the wall a little bit, and it will just soften that shadow.
Yeah. Exactly.
But
the other one with the lighting then was here. So just take you through sort of setting this shot up and getting to the final shot with this one. Wanted to photograph this compressor in situ.
It's a beast of a machine.
It is, yeah, it is indeed. So a couple of test shots to see how it's looking, getting the composition right. I think we moved some stuff afterwards. I can't remember. A couple more test shots. Tried it portrait to see if that helped. Not really. Went back to this. Here I've added in some artificial light from the side, and you can see just playing with the composition a bit, the exposure settings a bit, and then you can see you can sort of tell that this is lit with a flashlight off to the right here. And then I brought in another light there, so the difference between that one and that one, just bringing this side up a bit, and then just playing with that a bit more to get it to where I want it. And that was my final shot in the end, edited as well. So you can see it's quite warm in that one. I for this sort of shot, I like quite a cool look for the industrial stuff. I think it makes it look quite slick, but quite light here. I mean, it's very shiny and didn't have loads of time to get this shot, but so that bit is possibly a little bit brighter than I would have liked it to be. But for what they needed on this one, it was kind of almost a bit of a bonus, this shot, during that shoot. So, but that just gives you a little bit of insight into kind of building up the lighting around something to bring up the different areas that you want to focus on. And then also incorporated a shallow depth of field here as well, so that the subject is in focus but the background is blurred out, and again that just helps the subject to pop out from the photo. So with the combination of the lighting and the shallow depth of field, then for what we've got there, which was a pretty not untidy, but there's lots going on in the background.
There's a lot of detail, isn't there? It would draw your eye into the background.
If that was all sharp all the way through, you wouldn't know where you were supposed to be looking. So,
with the previous interior shot, how long would it take you to set that up, that photograph? How long did it take you to capture it?
This one, I can tell you exactly if you like, because that one I took at 10:21, and that one I took at 10:29. So about 8 minutes to get that one.
Yeah, so not too long for you, but actually it shows you didn't just stand there and snap a photo or snap a couple of photos. You took your time to get it right. And I imagine that's just one photo of many other photos that they would want.
Yeah,
for the kitchen,
there was
lots of close-ups and so on.
Yeah, I just picked one out of this sequence. I was photographing that kitchen for at least 2 hours, I think.
Yeah,
which would be pretty standard for a kitchen like that. But also, it's one of those things we were discussing it last night in our meeting, actually, that the more experienced you get, the quicker things get. But then you've got to be careful with your pricing, that you're not still pricing on time, because you actually end up earning less for the more experience that you gain, which is the wrong way around. So that shot probably a number of years ago would have taken me more like half an hour.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So certainly someone who's not experienced, they could spend a long time getting that shot.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
So you did have a shot you'd taken, a series of photos you'd taken recently. You said you might share, just to sort of show you a bit of a process of how you go through. I mean, you don't need to spend too long on it, but it's quite interesting to see. I think these were quite raw photos, so you haven't really edited them yet. But maybe just talk through a typical client process.
Yeah, so as I said before the call, I wouldn't normally show this, because this is literally all the raw photos from a shoot that they did this week, and this is what I've come back to the studio with from that shoot. We were shooting video at the same time, so there's probably a few less photos than there could be, but there's still 676 photos from the day there. So yeah, I'm being slightly brave here because I literally haven't looked through these photos at all. So hopefully there's a few good ones, but it does sort of show you a little bit of the process. So the first shots of the day, we were outside photographing this van. I'll zoom in a little bit. Photographing one of their branded vans, which I'll tell you what, if I do that, and you can see a bit more. Because we wanted their van next to their logo here, one of their service vans. So the van was driving up and driving back and driving in a few times. I think he did it about 4 or 5 times. And yeah, working on the composition, seeing what looks good. I quite like these ones where the van's facing that way. And again, yeah, you see came in and out a few times. Then we moved over to the front of the reception area, and we got a few photos of the reception area. So, I mean, this is quite a good example of what we're talking about earlier. So if I come into the develop module here quickly and go down to transform. So you can see here, this was on a wide angle. You can see we've got a bit of sort of distortion. The lines are going in like that. If I use the tool in here, I can tell it what should be vertical on either side of the photo. And then it will just make it vertical.
And distort it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it makes it how it should look, how you want it to look. And then, yeah, I haven't
it's how you see it with your eyes, because the camera is just faithfully recording everything. But actually, that's not how we perceive it.
Yeah, well, it's because the camera angle was quite low, you see. So it made those lines unvertical, diagonal. You know what I mean? So yeah, I haven't done anything to this yet, but I mean, to show you some examples of what you can do with the raw file, I can bring up.
Yeah, it really brings up the highlights, doesn't it? The detail that's in the dark.
Yeah, so I can
road surface.
balance it out like that and bring the highlights down a little bit. I can make the blacks a bit blacker, so makes it a bit more punchy. Like that. I can add a bit of texture, which is like a mild clarity to it, and then yeah, probably put a tiny bit of vibrance in. I might put a little bit of I quite like a little bit of vignette, shouldn't go over the top with it. And I'll probably bring the exposure up a little bit like that, and then you can see we've got to sort of, that's how it was before, so that's where we are now. And it might not be the final edit, but you know, just to give you
yeah, it makes a huge difference. And actually, in some of the subsequent photos, you had a person in there, and I think that can make a difference. I don't know if they will in this case, but
yeah,
certainly, like what I find that people can create a lot of nice photographs, but they don't have what I call a trace of life. I used to call it proof of life, but I think that's something for a hostage situation. A trace of life. So you can see, like in your kitchen example, maybe a trace of life would be some biscuits and a coffee on the table with a little bit of steam going up, or maybe a person sort of who's walked through and they're just picking up a paper or just reading a book. You can't see them, they're blurred, a bit like your example of the exhibition stand. But it gives that little trace of life, which is quite interesting, I think. Anyway, sorry, go on.
No, it's okay. Actually, here is a good example of, you're asking me about, you know, how photos can be used. So these 2 photos on the display here were ones I did for these guys 4 years ago. So there's a good example of them putting them to use. So this is the reception area, again, playing with the exposure a bit, then playing with the table and chairs. I just didn't like the way they were looking to start with, so move them around.
Didn't look inviting.
No, exactly. Felt a little bit more, inviting and natural. Onto here, trying to get those 2 signs in, just moving around a little bit till I felt the composition was right. We did some headshots, so setting up the lighting, and take a number of headshots, so we've got a few to choose from.
Make sure you're catching the smiles and not the frowns.
Exactly, yeah, and we've got various techniques to, you know, get people to
do you have lines like there's a lot of children's photographers or family photographers which will have things that they say just to get everyone giggling and laughing?
Yeah, my favorite, if they're not looking all that happy, is to ask them to just look 10% happier. Once they process,
and then that gets them smiling.
What that means, they're like, oh yeah. These ones I was looking forward to looking at, actually, so we'll have a quick look at these, because so this guy, let's come back to the beginning of the sequence, so you can see how long I was shooting this same person for. Started around here. again, you can see the difference without light and with light. So I'm using an external flashlight here. In this case, the flashlight didn't fire. You can see he looks a bit sort of just grey and washed out. But here you can see the light's fired onto him, and it pops him out from the background a bit more. So I was quite liking that angle, looking upwards a little bit so you don't see quite so much clutter down below. So that's a good tip for people, is to just change your angle a bit so that you're not seeing some of the clutter that you might have in the workshop or in the office. Again, there we go, no light, with light.
Yeah, huge difference, isn't it?
It just pops. And then came round, I think. So yeah, shallow depth of field, showing the other compressor in the foreground with the one he's working on in the background. And then if I come round, here we go. Yeah, so then I started photographing him from this angle, which I was pretty happy with, because we started making use of the lines back here. Can you see these? So they call this leading lines.
Sort of draw you into the center.
The lines, yeah, exactly. They bring your eye into the center. And in this case, I was focused on the product. The product is sharp. He's blurred out a bit. That's what we want to see in that case. The lines just all help bring you into that photo. So probably a bit more of it here, actually, because warehouse racking is always good for some leading lines. So take advantage of that where you can. But yeah, I think I'm just sort of flicking through quickly just to give you an idea of the kind of, shots that we would get and what we would come out with. And then it's a case of going through all of these and picking out the best.
How long would you spend doing this? So obviously you've got maybe a couple of hours or half a day there. And then how long are you spending?
This was a full day shoot.
That's a full day, right? So so if you were doing a full day shoot, how long would you take to not only go through and pick the right ones, edit them, refine?
I'd allow half a day at least for a shoot like this, and that's going through fairly quickly. Again, I've got pretty quick at it over the years. I have some sort of techniques that I use for making it quicker. For example, I'll usually start at the end of the shoot. So particularly when you're shooting products and things like that, you're sort of refining the shot as you go along. So if I went from here, for example, we're looking underside of the vehicle with the compressor unit fitted.
Yeah.
I would go backwards through this on the basis that if I go forwards, if I show you that shot, this is going forwards. I'm building it up to getting it to where I wanted it. And that was a horrible shot to get, by the way. I was underneath a lorry on my back on one of those roller things. Really uncomfortable. So
that's why you get the big bucks, Dan.
That's it. So I work backwards. And
yeah, that makes sense, actually, because then that does make sense.
Yeah. In Lightroom, we've got a flag system. So I'll just go through and I'll pick all my favorites by pressing P, which gives me the flag on there. So like that, you can see a little flag appears down here.
Yeah.
If I just go through, I'll just pick a few. They might not be the best ones, but just to show you. So I'm just going through, going pretty quick. Again, I've got pretty quick at this over the years. It used to take me a lot longer because I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe, or I was just worried about it or something. But you get to build that confidence, and then what we can do is we can filter for all the picked photos. So it just gives me the picked ones, and then I can work on those and develop them, and edit them and everything.
Yeah, that's great.
So
and then you work from there. Yeah,
quite a big help. But yeah, it just gives you an example of how many shots you would take and what you're looking for. Really, it's composition. It's if there's people in there, you're looking for them to be looking exactly right at the exact right moment, because everyone changes their facial expression very slightly. And building the light up, building the composition up, and until you're happy, really.
Yeah, and this is from a professional photographer. You've taken a lot of photos, so you're probably really minimizing the amount you do need to take. It just shows that if you are a novice or exploring it, you probably want to take as many as possible to experiment, at least to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. And then pick your favorites. One tip I heard many years ago, which I always use, is to pick your favorites rather than rejecting your negatives, because
Yes, you could be there for all day, couldn't you,
either
rejecting them? Yeah.
well, also, but at the end of rejecting all the ones that you don't like, you get to the end and you go, I'm crap.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Rather than
can't
looking at the
take
ones you've done
photos.
well on. Yeah.
Yeah, rather than picking your favorites and going, oh yeah, did all right. There's a few good shots there. So
Thanks for showing us all of that. It's really, I mean, I know a little bit about photography, but it's really good to see it in practice, and you demonstrate the difference that some of the changes will make, the different compositions. I think that's really valuable.
yeah.
What I'd like to end on, if it's all right,
Mm.
Dan, is just
Yeah.
going back to, if people want to find a photographer,
Mhm.
what should they be looking for? And maybe added to that, what brief would you like? What brief would photographers like to be given? Because they probably don't just want just make it look nice. They probably want a little more deep feeding than that.
Yeah, so in terms of picking the right photographer, you've got to find someone that's got experience in the sector that you're working in. There are plenty of generalist photographers out there, and to me, that's the mistake that photographers make, is in their own marketing, is being a generalist and not being specific about what they do. Because for example, if I'm a manufacturer and I come to a generalist and they've probably got a few good shots of some industrial stuff and it looks all right, and then they come to an industrial photographer whose website is just full of that, then it's an obvious choice, isn't it, for them, even if the price is a bit higher. And so, sorry, I'm going more into sort of marketing for photographers rather than what you asked me, but it's because I was talking about it yesterday. So I would look for someone that's got experience in what you're doing to start with, but also you've got to like the look and feel of their photos. So
Yeah.
when you go on their website, something's got to chime with you a little bit to say, yeah, I like what they're doing, because there's so many different styles of photo. It's not just the technical bits that we've talked about, getting the lighting right and the composition, but the way you then edit the photo can be completely different as well. We've got so many options and ways we can edit it. Like, some might look like a real sort of vintage kind of feel. Mm-hmm. In the way they edit it, and it all looks quite nice and atmospheric and everything, which has got a place. Or it might look a bit sharper and slicker, and the way they've edited it gives it that kind of feel. And that's that all comes down to what the photographer likes generally.
Yeah, and I guess you don't want to be pushing against their creative freedom too much, because you're just not going to get the best out of that person.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, if someone came to me and wanted some, I don't know, vintage looking wedding photography, I'd probably say I could do it, but I'm probably not the best person to do it, because I don't have loads of experience doing that. So you're better off with someone that knows what they're doing. So, if you're looking to photograph food, then you want a food photographer, because they've got all the experience and knowledge in that area, and
that can be hard. I know it can be quite difficult to get things food to look good, and some of it has to be artificial. You have to fake it a little bit to make it look right.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely an art.
I mean, yeah, and then so yeah, I think that's part of the main thing really, is making sure that you chime with what they've got on their website and what they're showing they can do and what they've done in the past. Then you've got to get in touch with them, obviously, and make sure that you get on with them, because no one wants to work with people they don't like. So
yeah,
that's the next thing really, is make sure you all get along. Then you're going to have a budget, so you're going to have to talk about your budget early on.
Do you think that's important? Because often I ask the same question: "What's your budget?" and people go, "I don't know. How much does it cost?" How do you get around that? I mean, how do you perceive a budget if people don't know how much they can spend? How do you broach that?
It's an interesting time you bring this up, because this is really like right at the top of my mind at the moment, because it's something I've been working on over the last few months, and we were discussing last night. I think I've got to talk about budget in the very first conversation with anyone now, and I've got to know what their budget expectations are, because I've had too many situations where I haven't been able to get a budget from people, and I've spent lots of time putting a proposal together, particularly around video, some with photography as well, where they're more complex shoots and things, and put it to them, and they've said, "Oh, that's well out of budget." And then you go, well, okay, so you did have a budget. Why didn't you tell me what the
Yeah,
budget
that's
was?
always my question. So you did have a figure in mind that you wouldn't spend.
Yeah, so it's a really it's a difficult one, because like someone was saying last night, if someone says, what's your budget? His worry was that, well, if I say I've got a 20 grand budget, they'll do the same thing for 20 grand that they
Yeah,
would have done for 10 grand, which,
yeah,
you know, from our point of view is not fair, because we're not just trying to rip people off. We just want to know to what level of quality we can go to. So I think somehow you've got to get a budget from people. And one example that I've had recently, which was for a video quote, I asked the budget question and they didn't know, and they said, you know, I don't really know what these things cost. You know, just kind of let me know. And I pushed it a bit more, and I was like, okay, you know, do you have any idea what, you know, where should it be? And sometimes I'll say, look, if I put in a quote for 10 grand, is that going to be too much? You know, you pitch it high, price anchoring and everything.
yeah.
In this case, she actually said, oh, yeah, you know, if it was silly money, then, you know, I wouldn't be able to do it. So it's like, okay, so what's silly money? And then she put a price on what silly money was, which was 10 grand. And I said, okay, we'll go away and we'll put together some proposals that are probably at the sort of 4, 6 and 11 region. But also, I think what I'm going to try and do going forward is making sure that I've got verbal agreement on a budget before I even leave that first call, to say, okay, if I come back to you with a quote that's in the kind of 2 grand region, is that going to be okay? And hopefully we get a yes, and then we know that it's okay. We can spend the time putting the proposal together.
Yeah, because it does take time, doesn't it? You know, your
Yeah,
care and consideration goes into that, because you're not ripping people off. It is about thinking, what's the balance?
yeah,
And with
yeah.
a budget, it might be, well, if they say they've got 20 grand, you say, well, we can spend that 20 grand for you, but we're not going to rip you off. It just means we can do more for you. You know, there might be lots of work that we can do for you for that budget. I think
Yeah, yeah.
it does come down to trust ultimately. I find something that
Does, yeah.
works is to bring in a similar project and say, well, here is a project that the budget was around this. So
Yeah,
if you're happy with what they have on their website and the costs they were paying, you're not going to give away exact costs because it's all different, but a rough idea of what that might cost, that helps definitely.
yeah, definitely. And also at the same time as giving them the budget there, you're also showing them that someone else was willing to pay what you're asking, and that you know it's an acceptable price to people in your industry. But I mean, the thing is that, you know, there are always going to be people that can do it cheaper for us, especially in our industry with photography. I mean, anyone can go and buy a camera from Curry's and call themselves a photographer for like,
Yeah.
you know, 300 quid or something. And if that's your budget and that's all you can afford at the moment, then that's fine. Go and do that and get the best you can, build your business. And then, you know, if you want to and you're able to in the future, then come back and we can do something. But, you know, from our point of view, I know that when I've been through periods where I've done a couple of discounts or something for some reason, I get overstretched. I don't do my best work because I don't have the time to do my best work, and everyone suffers from it. You know, I don't come out with the portfolio that I'd like to from a selfish point of view. They don't come out with the work that's as good as we could do for them. And so actually, by being able to give people the budget that they need to run their business and do their best work, everyone's benefiting, and you particularly as the client are benefiting, because you're going to get a better result.
Yeah, exactly. Something I've talked to Claire about pricing is that I know when I'm delivering a project, I'm going to give them everything. I'm not going to hold back on you know, ideas or things that we can do if I can do them. So it's always good to say, no, I'm going to stick to the price because I know they're going to get delivered for that. Just to wrap up, any other key things that you would like to be given when someone is briefing you on a project? Maybe 2 or 3 things that would be really useful, and then we'll wrap it up from there.
Yeah, I think the kind of feel, and I know that's sounds a bit like woo-woo, but kind of the feel of the photos that you're going for, and that's sort of driven by your brand, really. Like if you've got a light and airy kind of looking brand, then you want light and airy looking photos to accompany it. You don't want dark and moody shots on a dark background and things like that. So I think that's a really good basic thing to to understand, which you should understand from your brand guidelines already, I'd imagine. But you want to be clear on that, because you might look at the darker moody ones and go, oh yeah, I really like that, it looks really cool. But actually your brand is sort of light and and more pastel-y, if you know what I mean. So
what about deadline? Is that quite a useful thing to know? You know, what their expectations are?
yeah, usually if people have got a tight deadline, they will tell me. I mean, typically I tend to promise photos back within 2 weeks of the shoot, make sure I've got enough time to do the edit and everything. And generally people are happy with that. Occasionally they'll have a tight deadline, they're trying to get a website launched or something, and which is fine. If I have enough notice, I'm really happy to schedule in the editing time, you know, straight after the shoot. In fact, I've got one coming up like that in May, where it's like we need to do the shoot and the edit and get the photos back within like 2 days. So that's fine. I know that now. I've scheduled it all in, and I'll get it done. So yeah, deadline's a good one. I think who they're talking to, who they're trying to target, and what they're trying to show from the photos as well. So if you've got a product like that Ingersoll Rand one I showed you, the shoot from this week, sometimes we're looking at some of those compressors, and I don't know which is the business end of the compressor, what's interesting to the people buying the compressors. You know, because to me one bit looks quite cool, but actually the other bit, that's where all the business happens, and that's where the people buying the compressor, they're interested in that. They're interested in the quality, what's involved, you know, all those things which you might not know. So another example, when I go into those kitchens, for example, I'll always ask the guy that makes the kitchens, what's special about this kitchen? What are some of the features that are interesting that you want to show off? So I think once you start to, you know, get that, and going back to sort of the photographer that you choose as well, because this relates to this point, the photographer needs to have some interest in what you're shooting as well. So in what they're shooting, sorry, because it comes through. And I think I said in the previous episode that we did that that's kind of how I landed on the industrial stuff, because someone told me they were, well, our mutual friend John Johnson told me that he was struggling with getting a photographer to photograph an engineering application because he didn't really get the product and it wasn't coming through in the photos. And I think that's something people don't realize with photography and video, and probably a lot of creative things, is that if the person's not interested in what they're shooting, it's not going to look as good as someone that is interested in it. Because, and I don't even know how to explain it, but you just get in there, you love it, you're interested in the thing, and the photos show that.
That definitely makes sense. Dan, thank you very much for sharing. It's been really good to sort of look behind the curtain and see how you work. We'll make sure if anyone wants to find you, then they can go to your website, danbarkerstudios.com. We'll make sure there's a link to that in the notes to this, so they can go and have a look and see more of your other work. Before we finish though, Claire, would you just let us know what's coming up next week?
Yes, so next week you're going to be joined by Heidi Chamberlain-Jones from Minx Media to discuss the power of using persuasive words in your marketing that can be used as a tipping point to generate more sales.
Yes. Yeah, she'll be great. It's been a little while since I've worked with Heidi, but we've done a few workshops together and she's always engaging. So that's a really good one. Well, we're here every Friday from 10 a.m. If you want to ask any question or you want to be a guest, email support@ratherinventive.com. And remember, all of our episodes are available on ratherinventive.com/club. That's ratherinventive.com/club. Thank you very much for watching. Dan, thanks for coming, and we'll see you all next week.